In my previous paper, I focused on the idea of language degenerating as humans get older. Specifically, I was observing my great-grandfather, who just turned 95. Specific ideas I talked about were the lack of pragmatics and his language use in social interactions. As soon as my brother, or my cousins, or my grandparents, or my parents interjected or asked a question unexpectedly, my great-grandfather Pop became confused and couldn't really comprehend what was being asked. He did a lot better interacting with my family and I in smaller, quieter spaces. Went out to dinner, it was really hard for him to kind of interact with us because of the loud noise circulating the restaurant. Pop's peripheral nervous system, which plays an important role in speech, language, and hearing, is something else that I talked about. And I thought that this could play a big role in why Pop struggles to comprehend unexpected questions and comments. And finally, a big concept I talked about was Wernicke's area in the temporal lobe, which is responsible for comprehending and understanding spoken language. In this video, I will discuss some new ideas as well as expand on ideas touched upon in my first paper. After multiple observations of my great-grandfather, I realized his lack of pragmatics can correlate with his turn-taking as well as his inability to tell a narrative, or as his ability to tell narratives. Additionally, I found new interesting ideas about his vocabulary and mental lexicon functions. So after I did a variety of observations, I realized that one of the first things that Pop struggled with was turn-taking. Turn-taking specifically is the mechanism by which people taking turns in a conversation, and the conversation is usually between at least two people. I kind of found that this idea kind of went back with his pragmatics. He has trouble understanding the words being spoken to him, especially when least expected. So for example, if he was telling a story or talking about something that he did the last week, and my brother asked a question or made a comment, he kind of paused and was kind of taken back and wasn't really sure exactly what to say. So although Pop really struggled with turn-taking, he was really good at telling narratives, which makes sense because a narrative does not require listeners' response, according to Sandra Levy's book, Introduction to Language Development. Rather, narratives consist of an extended monologue, which one can include recounting of personal events and experiences. They can kind of tell their own self-generated stories. They can tell and retell familiar tales. So really at a young age, we are beginning to understand the structure of a narrative. In class, we've watched a variety of videos of little kids talking about monkeys or birds or other things, and they're kind of just going off and telling a story. Levy explains by the age of 5, we are able to tell a true narrative, which contains setting, information, a series of events, and as well as consequences and motivation. So ultimately, this idea seems to stay pretty consistent throughout a lifespan. It was clear that Pop was good at this because he was telling, he was the one always telling the narratives, telling stories. He was able to talk about things such as World War II, places him and my great-grandmother had visited, memories about my grandma and her sisters when they were little girls. So he clearly knew and remembered all these things and knew how to portray it because we could all understand. But I did notice that it took him a little longer to get through this story, but this usually happens a lot of times with older adults. So another thing I realized was Pop's vocabulary throughout the conversations he was having, throughout the stories he was telling. A person's vocabulary is a set of familiar words within that person's language. This generally develops with age and is a fundamental tool for communication. I was realizing that Pop's vocabulary didn't seem as good as it was in the years past. So for example, his narrative skills were good and he knew what he was talking about, but within the storytelling, his vocabulary didn't seem as extensive as it used to be. So curious as to why this may be happening and to see whether or not vocabulary has some sort of relationship with age, I looked further into it and I found a study on normal cognitive aging. And I found that the abilities such as conceptual reasoning, memory, and processing speed decline gradually over time. And this fluid ability begins to decline in the 3rd decade in life and then continues throughout the lifespan. So being 95, my great-grandfather is way past his 3rd decade of life. And ultimately, this slowing of this ability can negatively impact performance on many neuropsychological tests. And these tests are usually designed to measure cognitive domains such as verbal fluency. And these tests have shown a decline in processing speed, processing speed can have implications across a variety of cognitive domains, and these things can be processing speed, certain memory, language, and executive functions. So this study can easily explain why stories take much longer to tell when coming from older individuals. Specifically, Pop's processing speed is slower than the processing speed for someone my age or my parents' age. So finally, I found it interesting when reading about the mental lexicon. Levy describes the mental lexicon as a mental dictionary that holds all the words an individual has acquired. I was curious as to how this could have an effect on the language of my great-grandfather. After reading up on a study called The Aging Lexicon, Differences in the Semantic Networks of Younger and Older Adults, I found that age does have an effect on the mental lexicon. So specifically, if older adults have access to an increasing number of words, then their mental lexicon is larger. The study then compared this to a library. So in a bigger library compared to a smaller library, it's a lot harder to find a book. This is the same idea for someone with a smaller lexicon than someone with a larger one. Retrieving information from a larger mental lexicon, it should take more time and be more error prone than someone with a smaller lexicon. So based on findings that associate network clustering with processing speed, the structure of the mental lexicon of older adults could contribute to the apparent cognitive function. Ultimately, this research helped me understand why Pop's language functions are so much slower. Due to his age, his mental lexicon is definitely a lot bigger. Therefore, finding out what he wants to say kind of takes more time. And additionally, just with age, he could also just be starting to forget some of the words that he's trying to say. So overall, I was looking at how age has an impact on the spoken language. It is clear that certain functions start to degenerate as individuals get older, which affects their abilities to articulate and process information. And personally, I learned that language can go full circle throughout a person's lifespan. So humans start as babies, trying to acquire language in a variety of ways. Throughout the semester, it has been clear that there's no one way to do this. Rather, there's a lot of factors that go into learning language. As babies grow older, they're still learning new words, and by the age of 5, children should have about 1,800 words in their mental lexicon. Throughout a person's adolescent and adult years, they're still learning new things, but they're staying on more of a linear path, so it's not like they're learning too much, but they're not forgetting too much. Then these adults become seniors and grandparents, and they're starting to lose their quality and speed of some of these functions, and eventually some of these abilities just don't function at all how they used to function. And so this project really has just opened my eyes more about the functions and abilities individuals have on the spoken language.